The desert rarely kills in a single moment. It waits. It waits for the sun to drain the strength from your body. It waits for thirst to burn your throat until swallowing feels useless. It waits for hope to grow thin and then disappear. Beneath the pale shadow of a low desert bush, a child lay still. No tent, no shelter, no water left in the skin beside him. Only heat, sand, and the sound of wind moving across the ground like a quiet warning. A woman stood some distance away, her back turned. Not because she did not love her son, but because she could not bear to watch him die. Her name was Hagar. The child's name was Ishmael. Long before this moment, before the desert and the silence, this child had already been named not by his parents but by God himself. Ishmael means God hears. And yet here he was, abandoned, forgotten by men lying between life and death. If God truly hears, then why had it come to this? This story does not begin in the wilderness. It begins in a household blessed with promises yet fractured by impatience and fear. Abraham was a man called by God, promised descendants as numerous as the stars. Sarah was his wife, faithful, strong, but barren. Year after year passed, and the promise seemed distant. Silence stretched where hope once lived. So a decision was made not by faith but by human reasoning. Hagar, an Egyptian servant, was chosen to bear a child for Abraham. What followed was not celebration but tension. A child conceived in desperation carries a heavy burden from the start. Ishmael was born. Abraham loved him. For a time the household tried to hold together, but jealousy has a way of growing quietly. Words sharpened, glances hardened, peace disappeared. Then the impossible happened. Sarah gave birth to Isaac, the child of promise. With Isaac's arrival, Ishmael's place in the family began to fade. During a feast celebrating Isaac, Sarah looked at Ishmael and saw not a child but a threat. She turned to Abraham and spoke words that would change everything. "Send this woman and her son away. Not tomorrow, not with preparation." Abraham was torn apart. Ishmael was his son, but God allowed it. And so at dawn, Abraham placed bread and a skin of water into Hagar's hands. No escort, no protection, no explanation for a boy too young to understand why his father would not come with him. Hagar and Ishmael walked into the wilderness. The water did not last long. As the sun climbed higher, the boy's steps slowed. When the water was gone, hope vanished with it. Hagar placed Ishmael beneath a bush, the only shade she could find. Then she walked away. She lifted her voice and wept. "Let me not see the death of the child." But something remarkable happens here, something easy to miss. Scripture does not say, God heard Hagar's cries. It says, God heard the voice of the child, a weak cry, barely a sound, yet powerful enough to move heaven itself. An angel called out from above, "Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy's cry where he is. Lift him up. I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened Hagar's eyes. She saw a well of water. It had not appeared out of nowhere. It had been there all along. But despair had blinded her to it. Ishmael drank. He lived. And in that moment, something became clear. The promise had not been revoked. It had been redirected. This child would not inherit Abraham's land. He would not dwell in tents of promise. He would not stand within the lineage of kings. Instead, he would grow up in the wilderness. And the wilderness would shape him. The desert would teach him to survive without comfort, to live without guarantees, to endure when nothing is certain. Ishmael would become strong not in palaces but under open skies. The boy who nearly died beneath a bush would one day become the father of 12 leaders. A people would rise from the sand, not crowned by men, but sustained by God. In the next chapter of this story, we will see how the desert transformed a rejected child into the founder of a nation, and why Ishmael's legacy still echoes across history today. Ishmael did not grow up surrounded by walls, servants, or inherited blessings. His classroom was the wilderness. His teachers were hunger, heat, and silence, and his curriculum was survival. The desert that almost killed him became the place that raised him. There were no lullabies in Ishmael's childhood, only the sound of wind scraping across stone. No permanent home, only tents that could be folded and moved before danger arrived. Each sunrise meant uncertainty. Each sunset meant survival for one more day. Hagar stayed with her son. She taught him what she knew: how to ration water, how to recognize the signs of a coming sandstorm, how to read the ground for tracks left behind. But soon Ishmael learned lessons no mother could teach. He learned that hesitation could be fatal, that noise could attract enemies, that strength without awareness was useless. The boy who once lay helpless beneath a bush grew into a young man whose eyes were always scanning the horizon. Scripture tells us that God was with Ishmael as he grew. But God's presence did not remove hardship. It sharpened him through it. Ishmael became an archer. This was no accident. In the open desert, a bow meant distance. Distance meant survival. You could hunt without exposing yourself. You could defend without standing face to face with danger. The bow turned patience into power. Day after day, Ishmael practiced. His hands grew calloused. His aim grew steady. His body adapted to long journeys under relentless heat. While others relied on cities and walls, Ishmael relied on movement. He became difficult to capture, impossible to corner, dangerous to underestimate. Hagar found him a wife from Egypt, her homeland. From that union, a family began to form, not bound to one place, but to one another. Ishmael did not teach his children how to build cities. He taught them how to leave before cities collapsed. They learned where water might appear after rare rains. They memorized hidden wells. They learned how to travel light and strike fast. The desert did not just shape their bodies, it shaped their identity. Meanwhile, beyond the wilderness, great civilizations were rising. Kingdoms built walls, kings gathered armies. Empires expanded their borders and marked the land with stone and blood. But the desert resisted them all. Armies marched in confident lines only to run out of water. Merchants followed maps only to find empty ground where wells were supposed to be. Messengers vanished without explanation. Those who did not understand the desert never controlled it. Ishmael's growing family learned to move like shadows. They did not seek conquest but control of trade routes of water, sources of passageways others feared to enter. They became known and whispered about. Scripture describes Ishmael as living in hostility toward all his brothers. This was not random violence. It was the posture of a people forged by rejection. They trusted no promises from men. They relied on no alliances that could betray them. They stood ready, always. Yet Ishmael was not merely surviving. He was fulfilling a promise spoken over him long ago. God had said, "I will make him into a great nation." Greatness did not come through palaces or monuments. It came through endurance. Through expansion across harsh lands others avoided. Through sons who became leaders in their own right. 12 sons, 12 chiefs. 12 names remembered. Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, Kedema. Each one led a clan. Each one carried the wilderness within him. Together they formed a people who spread from Egypt toward Assyria, just as God had promised. Ishmael had no throne, but he had influence. He had no city, but he had reach. And though his path had diverged from Isaac's, his life was not erased from God's plan. Years later, when Abraham died, Ishmael returned. No announcement, no invitation, yet there he stood beside Isaac. The two brothers, born of the same father, shaped by very different promises, came together to bury the man who had changed both their lives. No argument is recorded, no reconciliation speech, only silence and shared duty. Then they parted again, each to his own destiny. Isaac returned to the land of promise. Ishmael returned to the open desert. But make no mistake, this was not a story of abandonment. It was a story of divergence. In the next chapter, we will see how Ishmael's descendants became a force history could not ignore, and why the legacy of a rejected child still echoes across continents, faiths, and generations. The desert does not record history in ink. It remembers through movement. Footprints vanish within hours, but patterns remain. Camps are dismantled, yet roots endure. And long after voices fall, silent names continue to travel on the wind. So it was with the sons of Ishmael. They did not inherit a single territory marked by borders and walls. Instead, they inherited range. From the edge of Egypt to the shadow of Assyria, their presence spread like a network of living paths across the wilderness. Where others saw emptiness, they saw opportunity. Where others feared exposure, they found freedom. Each of Ishmael's 12 sons became more than a family leader. They became the nucleus of tribes, distinct in character, yet bound by shared origin and memory. Nebaioth's people became known for their flocks and reliability. Caravan leaders trusted their word. Kedar's descendants gained a reputation as fierce warriors and skilled archers, respected even by their enemies. Duma and Massa learned diplomacy, forming alliances where others chose conflict. Tema established strategic resting points, oases of order, in an unforgiving land. These were not kings ruling from thrones. They were princes of movement leaders whose authority came from wisdom, endurance, and adaptability. The surrounding empires took notice. At first, they underestimated them. How could nomads without cities, without monuments, without standing armies matter to the great powers of the world? Babylon believed control came from maps. Assyria believed control came from force. Egypt believed control came from tradition and legacy. The sons of Ishmael believed control came from knowing the land better than anyone else. Trade routes crossed their territories. Caravans carrying incense, myrrh, spices, gold, and salt had no choice but to negotiate passage. Wells could not be reached without permission. Shortcuts could not be taken without guidance. The desert became a living gate, and the Ishmaelites held the keys. They did not tax through decrees. They negotiated through presence. They did not conquer cities. They made themselves indispensable. Merchants learned quickly, disrespect meant delay or disappearance. Cooperation meant safe passage and protection. And so without ever building an empire, Ishmael's descendants influenced many. The prophets would later speak their names. Isaiah mentioned Kedar, not as a footnote, but as a known force, its tents, its flocks, its warriors. Jeremiah named the desert kingdoms directly. Ezekiel described their role in trade, listing them alongside the great merchants of the ancient world. This was not mythology. It was recognition. The boy once left beneath a bush had become the father of a people no empire could ignore. Yet within the camps, Ishmael himself remained unchanged. He did not elevate himself above others. He did not claim divine authority over his sons. He ruled by memory, by reminding them who they were and where they came from. At night by the fire, stories were told. About the day water ran out, about the unseen well, about the angel's voice, about a God who heard when no one else did. These stories were not told to glorify suffering, but to preserve humility, to remind each generation that survival was not guaranteed and that strength must never become arrogance. Ishmael aged slowly like the land that raised him. His hair grew silver, his steps became measured, but his presence still commanded silence. When tribal leaders gathered to decide disputes or alliances, Ishmael spoke last. Not because he lacked authority, but because his word ended debate. He carried no crown. Yet men bowed their heads. He wore no robe. Yet his reputation traveled farther than any banner. Legends formed around him. Some exaggerated, some whispered, some true. They said he could hear danger before it arrived, that his arrows never missed, that the desert itself warned him. But when asked, Ishmael never spoke of himself as a hero. He spoke of listening to the wind, to the silence, to the signs others ignored. He taught his sons that freedom demanded vigilance, that the land gives nothing without cost, that peace must be protected, not assumed. One night, a rival group attempted to seize a well under cover of darkness. Iron weapons gleamed in the moonlight. They expected fear. Instead, they found resistance. Hidden archers, rolling stones, precision strikes. No battle cries, no pursuit. By dawn, the attackers were gone, and the well remained. Ishmael walked among the aftermath, his face grave. There was no celebration, only necessity. Kneeling by the water, he placed his hand on the stone rim and said to his sons, "Never surrender what God has given you." They understood. The desert was theirs not by conquest but by survival. And in the next chapter, that survival will collide with memory reconciliation and a final moment that would bind two brothers together if only for a single, silent act. Death has a way of silencing unfinished stories. The wind still moved across the land, the flocks still grazed, and the tents of the tribe still rose and fell with the seasons, but something had shifted. A presence that once shaped every journey was now gone. Abraham was dead. The man who had heard God's call, who had left everything familiar behind, who had walked between promise and uncertainty for over a century, had finally come to rest. Scripture says he died old and satisfied with life. Yet satisfaction does not erase complexity. Because Abraham left behind more than a legacy of faith. He left behind two sons. Isaac, the son of the promise, remained in the land of inheritance, surrounded by flocks, altars, and the continuity of covenant. Ishmael, the son of exile, lived far away among tents that moved with the wind father to princes who knew no walls. Years had passed since they last stood face to face. No letters were exchanged. No messengers traveled between their camps. No attempts at reconciliation are recorded. And yet when Abraham died, Ishmael came. No invitation summoned him. No servant rode out to the desert to call his name. Still he knew. Blood has a language older than words. Loss has a sound that carries farther than any message. Ishmael arrived quietly. His hair was streaked with silver now. His posture carried the weight of long journeys and longer memories. The bow still rested across his back, not as a threat, but as a reminder of who he was and where he came from. Isaac saw him approach. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them held decades of history, the laughter of childhood, the tension in their father's household, the day of separation, the years of unanswered questions. The son who stayed and the son who was sent away stood on the same ground again. Between them lay their father's body. There were no accusations, no apologies, no explanations demanded. Only recognition. Together they lifted Abraham's body. Not servants, not hired hands. The two sons themselves carried the weight. Side by side they walked toward the cave of Machpelah, the burial place Abraham had purchased years earlier, a piece of land secured not by conquest, but by faith. This was the same cave where Sarah rested, the woman whose decisions had shaped both their lives, the woman whose fear had led to division and whose absence now left only memory. As they walked, the past lingered like dust in the air. Ishmael remembered the jar of water pressed into his hands, the silence of his father, the burning sun, the bush beneath which he nearly died. Isaac remembered a childhood defined by expectation, a father who tested faith beyond reason, a life shaped by promise rather than choice. Both carried wounds. But in that moment, neither was greater than the other. They laid Abraham to rest. No loud prayers were recorded. No dramatic reconciliation unfolded. The earth closed over the body of the man who had shaped the destiny of nations, and the silence spoke louder than words ever could. When it was finished, Ishmael stood still. He looked at the stones sealing the grave, not with bitterness, but with understanding. The man buried there had loved him, yet had sent him away, had given him life, yet allowed exile. And still Ishmael did not curse him. Time had softened what anger could not heal. Ishmael understood now Abraham had acted in obedience to what he believed was God's will. The wound had been real, but so was the promise that followed. God had not abandoned him. Isaac felt it too. The brother before him was no longer a rival nor a forgotten child. He was a patriarch in his own right, a father of tribes, a man whose life testified that God's favor does not follow human hierarchy. For a brief moment, they were not divided by destiny. They were simply sons. Then without ceremony, Ishmael turned away. He did not embrace Isaac. He did not linger. He mounted his animal and returned to the desert, not in anger, not in retreat, but because that was where he belonged. Isaac remained behind, returning to his flocks, his altars, and the land promised to him. His path would continue within boundaries. Ishmael's would continue without them. Their stories diverged once more. Yet they were never fully separate. Because that day, two brothers buried one father and sealed a truth that history would echo for generations. God's purposes are wider than one lineage, deeper than one promise, and powerful enough to sustain even those who walk a different path. In the next chapter, we will see how Ishmael's descendants stepped fully into that destiny, shaping trade culture and history across the ancient world. Ishmael never returned to Abraham's tents. After the burial, he did not look back again. Not because his heart was hardened, but because his destiny no longer lay behind him. The desert was not a place of loss anymore. It had become a domain. What once symbolized rejection now represented reach. As years passed, the sons of Ishmael expanded farther across the arid lands. Their camps appeared where no city dared to rise. Their flocks grazed where farmers failed. Their trade routes cut across terrain that frightened even seasoned travelers. The desert, once a threat, had become an advantage. Caravans learned this quickly. To cross the vast spaces between Egypt, Arabia, and Mesopotamia, merchants needed more than maps. They needed permission. They needed protection. They needed knowledge passed down, not through books, but through generations who had survived there. And that knowledge belonged to the sons of Ishmael. They knew where water could be found when wells ran dry. They knew which stars guided travelers safely through endless nights. They knew when winds would shift and sand would betray careless footsteps. Trade flourished not because of armies, but because of trust. Gold, incense, myrrh, spices, salt wealth moved along paths guarded by Ishmaelite tribes. Phoenician sailors, Babylonian merchants, Egyptian traders all negotiated with them. No empire could bypass them without consequence. They did not conquer marketplaces. They became unavoidable. Their influence spread quietly without banners or declarations. There were no capitals, no thrones, no monuments carved into stone. Instead, there were agreements, honored passages secured, and reputations built on reliability. The tribes of Ishmael became a stabilizing force in unstable lands. Yet their strength was not merely economic. Culturally, they forged a way of life defined by mobility and restraint. Possessions were kept light. Leadership was earned, not inherited blindly. Authority rested with elders who remembered hardship and measured decisions carefully. Freedom was sacred. No man ruled absolutely. Councils decided disputes. Elders guided the young. Every tribe carried responsibility not just to itself but to the name they shared. Ishmael remained at the center, not as a king but as a reference point. When conflicts arose between tribes, his memory shaped their response. When ambition tempted expansion beyond wisdom, his story reminded them of humility. When younger leaders sought glory, the elders spoke of survival instead. He had taught them this: to endure is greater than to dominate. Prophets would later observe this people with fascination. Isaiah spoke of Kedar's tents not as symbols of weakness but of resilience. Jeremiah listed desert kingdoms descended from Ishmael as real political entities. Ezekiel described their role in international trade, placing them among the great commercial powers of the ancient world. The boy once left to die had become a name recorded by prophets. And yet within the tribes, Ishmael was remembered not for power, but for listening. Stories told around campfires did not exaggerate his victories. They remembered his silence, his patience, his refusal to rule through fear. They remembered the well. That unseen, well revealed when all hope was gone, became a symbol. It reminded them that survival was not earned by strength alone, but sustained by divine attention. God hears, they would say. He heard our father. He hears us still. As Ishmael aged, his role became quieter. He walked less. He watched more. Younger leaders handled daily decisions, but none dismissed his counsel. When he spoke, it was brief and final. His bow still hung nearby. Its string remained taut, its wood polished by time. It was no longer a weapon. It was a witness. On ceremonial days, Ishmael would release a single arrow into the wind at sunset. No target. No applause. Just the sound of flight disappearing into silence. It was a ritual of remembrance. Of the day he had been sent away. Of the day God heard his cry. Of the journey from abandonment to belonging. The sons watched, the grandsons asked questions, and the story continued. By the time Ishmael's hair turned fully white, his name had traveled farther than his feet ever could. From the borders of Egypt to the Euphrates, people knew of the desert tribes who answered to no king, yet commanded respect from all. He had not inherited a land. He had shaped one. And in the next chapter, we will see how this legacy endured beyond his lifetime, how his name moved from living memory into legend, scripture, and history itself. Time moves differently in the desert. It does not announce itself with calendars or clocks. It reveals itself in weathered faces, in slower steps in hands that once drew bows with ease and now rest more often in stillness. Ishmael felt time this way. His strength did not leave him suddenly. It receded quietly like water sinking beneath the sand. The tribes continued to move, trade, and defend their lands. Sons and grandsons took leadership roles. Councils met. Fires burned at dusk. Life carried on. But everyone knew something was changing. The center was shifting. Ishmael no longer walked at the front of the camps. He remained near the heart of them, seated at the entrance of his tent, watching caravans pass, listening to reports from distant routes, observing the world he had helped shape. He spoke less. Yet when he did, every word carried weight. Younger leaders sought his presence not for commands, but for confirmation. A nod from him settled disputes. Silence from him signaled caution. He had become something rarer than a ruler. He had become memory made flesh. The stories surrounding him grew, but Ishmael never encouraged them. When others spoke of his skill as a hunter or the accuracy of his arrows, he redirected the conversation. When praised for victories, he reminded them of losses survived. He told them this: "Do not remember me for what I overcame. Remember why I endured." At night, when the camps grew quiet, Ishmael sometimes stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. He thought of his mother Hagar, her fear, her faith, her refusal to watch him die. He thought of Abraham, strong, conflicted, obedient, silent. He thought of the well that appeared when there was nothing left. That moment had never left him. It had become the lens through which he understood everything else. The desert did not frighten him anymore, nor did death. He had faced both as a child and survived. What mattered now was continuity, ensuring that what God had begun would not dissolve with his passing. So he gathered his sons often, not for grand speeches, not for laws carved in stone. He spoke in reminders. Remember who you are. Remember where you began. Remember that freedom demands discipline. Remember that God hears even when men do not. 12 sons sat before him, each different, each shaped by the same wilderness. 12 leaders who would soon carry the weight of tribes without their father's shadow. Ishmael looked at them and saw the promise fulfilled. Once he had been a boy, no one expected to survive. Now before him stood men whose names were already shaping history. Scripture would later call them princes. But in Ishmael's eyes, they were stewards. As seasons passed, word of Ishmael's age spread beyond the tribes. Merchants spoke of him with reverence. Leaders of neighboring peoples adjusted their tone when his name was mentioned. Even those who never met him felt his presence. They said the desert listened to him, that the wind changed when he passed, that no one ever surprised him. Some stories were exaggerated, others were not. Once a group of raiders attempted to seize a well controlled by one of his sons. They came at night confident and armed. They did not expect Ishmael himself to be there. He stood between them and the water. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply released an arrow. It struck the sand inches from their leader's feet. That was enough. They retreated without a word. When asked later why he had not killed them, Ishmael answered quietly, "Fear is a better boundary than blood." This was how he ruled without ruling. Eventually, the day came when Ishmael no longer rose from his mat as quickly. His breathing slowed. His vision dimmed, but his mind remained sharp. He knew his time was near. The desert that had raised him would soon receive him. There was no fear in this knowledge, only completion. He had not built cities. He had not written laws. He had not left monuments. Yet he had done something greater. He had turned rejection into identity, exile into expansion, silence into legacy. And in the next chapter, that legacy will cross generations, moving from living memory into sacred record where prophets, poets, and nations will speak his name. When Ishmael died, the desert did not mourn loudly. There were no cities to shut their gates, no temples to sound their horns, no empire to declare a day of silence. Yet something unmistakable settled over the land, a pause heavy and deliberate, as if the wilderness itself acknowledged the passing of one who had learned to live in harmony with it. His body returned to the earth that had shaped him, but his name did not. The sons of Ishmael buried their father with honor. No lavish tomb marked the place. No monument pointed future generations to his resting site. That was never his way. His legacy was not meant to be visited, it was meant to be lived. And lived it was. The 12 sons stepped fully into leadership. Each tribe continued along its appointed paths, spreading farther, growing stronger, adapting with each generation. What had once been a single family under a tent became a constellation of clans, stretched across vast distances. From Egypt's borders to the Euphrates, people spoke the same name in different tongues. Ishmael. Merchants invoked it when negotiating passage. Travelers whispered it when asking for protection. Rulers weighed it when considering desert campaigns. Even those who dismissed the tribes as nomads learned to respect the invisible lines they guarded. The desert had boundaries now, not drawn on parchment but enforced through memory and consequence. Caravans that honored agreements passed safely. Those who did not often vanished, swallowed by heat, distance, and silence. No army ever fully conquered the desert tribes because there was no capital to seize, no king to dethrone, no single blow that could break them. They were everywhere and nowhere. This unsettled the great powers. Babylonian records mention desert traders whose loyalty could not be bought. Assyrian campaigns skirted certain regions without explanation. Egyptian merchants learned that speed mattered less than permission. The sons of Ishmael did not need to announce their authority. The land announced it for them. Over time, something remarkable happened. Their story moved from oral tradition into sacred memory. Hebrew prophets, men whose words shaped nations, began to name them directly, not as rumors, not as metaphors, but as realities. Isaiah spoke of Kedar, describing its tents, its flocks, its warriors. Jeremiah listed the desert kingdoms descending from Ishmael alongside established powers. Ezekiel placed them in the web of international trade, acknowledging their role in the movement of wealth across the ancient world. The boy once nearly forgotten beneath a bush was now etched into prophecy. And the irony was unmistakable. Ishmael had never sought recognition, yet recognition found him. He had lived outside the covenant given to Isaac, yet his descendants stood within God's unfolding history. The tribes preserved his memory carefully. Stories of Ishmael were told not to inspire conquest but to cultivate restraint. Children learned early that their strength came from awareness, not aggression, from endurance, not excess. They remembered that their father had been heard when he was weakest. This shaped their worldview. When drought came, they moved rather than fought. When conflict arose, they defended what mattered and withdrew from what did not. When opportunity appeared, they negotiated before they dominated. Their identity was not built on what they owned, but on what they could navigate. Generations passed. Names evolved. Tribes merged, split, and expanded. Some settled temporarily. Others roamed farther than before. Yet the core story remained unchanged. A child expelled, a mother who wept, a well revealed, a promise fulfilled. Even those who opposed them understood one truth. The Ishmaelites were not a people born of chance. They were formed by survival, guided by memory, and sustained by a promise older than empires. As centuries unfolded, the name Ishmael continued to echo beyond the desert. Poets referenced him. Psalmists alluded to the tents of his descendants. His lineage became intertwined with the broader story of the region, sometimes in tension, sometimes in trade, always present. He had not ruled Jerusalem. He had not built altars in Canaan. Yet his blood flowed through countless lives, shaping the ancient world. The desert had not erased him. It had amplified him. And in the next chapter, we will see how this legacy crossed not only generations, but faith traditions. How Ishmael's story became a bridge between peoples, scriptures, and identities that still shape the world today. As centuries passed, Ishmael's story did something rare. It refused to belong to only one people. Most ancient figures are claimed defended, confined within borders of belief. Their meaning is guarded, their memory narrowed. Ishmael was different. His name crossed boundaries that others could not. He lived between covenants, between tents and altars, between promise and exclusion. And it was precisely this tension that carried his story forward. In Hebrew scripture, Ishmael is remembered honestly, neither erased nor idealized. He is the son who did not inherit the covenant of Isaac, yet he is never abandoned by God. His survival is not accidental. His lineage is not incidental. God hears him. God blesses him. God multiplies him. This unsettled easy categories. Ishmael became a reminder that divine attention was not limited to one line, one land, or one outcome. The God who chose Isaac did not discard Ishmael. The God of promise was also the God of compassion. Later generations wrestled with this. Some viewed Ishmael as a symbol of conflict, an ancestor of tension between brothers. Others saw him as proof that God's mercy extended beyond boundaries humans tried to enforce. Both interpretations carried weight, but the story did not stop there. Far from the deserts where Ishmael once walked, new traditions began to emerge. Traditions that looked back to him, not as a peripheral figure, but as a patriarch in his own right. In Arab genealogies, Ishmael was remembered as a foundational ancestor. Not a footnote, but a starting point. His endurance, his independence, his desert wisdom became defining traits passed down through generations. He was no longer merely the son of Abraham. He was the father of a people. In Islamic tradition, his story deepened further. Ishmael was not simply spared in the wilderness. He was chosen alongside his father in acts of obedience. The desert was not just a place of survival, but of submission and trust in God. The well that saved him as a child became a sacred symbol of provision. His lineage became intertwined with pilgrimage, prayer, and identity. And so one man's life stood at the crossroads of faiths. Not because everyone agreed about him, but because no one could ignore him. What makes Ishmael remarkable is not theological alignment. It is theological persistence. Across scriptures, across cultures, across centuries, the same core truth remains. Ishmael was seen. Ishmael was heard. Ishmael was sustained. Even when interpretations diverged, this foundation held firm. The desert boy became a shared memory, a figure reminding different peoples that God's work does not unfold in straight lines, that rejection and blessing can exist side by side, that inheritance is not always material, and destiny is not always obvious. This made Ishmael uncomfortable to simplify. He disrupted narratives that wanted clean divisions chosen versus forgotten insider versus outsider. His life insisted that reality was more complex. And complexity, once introduced, cannot be undone. As empires rose and fell, as religions formed and reformed, Ishmael remained present, sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in the margins, but never erased. He became a bridge. Not a bridge of agreement, but of shared origin. A reminder that long before doctrines were written, there were families. Before nations drew borders, there were brothers. Before theology hardened into institutions, there were human stories shaped by fear, hope, and divine intervention. Ishmael's life carried all of that. His story asked uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to be blessed without being chosen? What does survival say about purpose? Who decides which lives carry sacred weight? These questions did not fade with time. They grew louder. And perhaps that is why Ishmael continues to matter. He stands as a living contradiction to simplistic faith, a witness that God's involvement in human history is broader, deeper, and less predictable than we often assume. In the next chapter, we will see how this shared legacy born in the desert shaped real-world relationships, conflicts, and identities that still influence the modern world. Because Ishmael's story did not end in Scripture. It walked forward into history. As Ishmael's descendants spread across deserts and trade routes, something subtle but powerful began to happen. Bloodlines turned into identities. Identities hardened into loyalties. And loyalties over time became borders. Not borders drawn on maps, but borders carried in memory, language, and story. The ancient world did not understand nationhood the way we do today. People were not defined first by territory, but by ancestry. Who you descended from shaped who you trusted, who you traded with, and who you fought. And Ishmael's descendants remembered exactly who they were. They remembered a father who survived abandonment, a lineage formed outside city walls, a blessing that came without possession of promised land. This made them different. They did not cling to soil, they moved with seasons. They did not depend on walls, they relied on awareness. They did not measure strength by cities, but by adaptability. Meanwhile, Isaac's descendants followed a different path. They settled, they built, they cultivated land and law. Their identity became anchored in covenant territory and temple. Stability became their strength and sometimes their vulnerability. Two lineages, two ways of surviving, both rooted in the same father. As centuries unfolded, these differences shaped interactions. Sometimes there was cooperation. Caravans passed safely through Ishmaelite-controlled routes, bringing wealth and goods to settled regions. Sometimes there was tension, misunderstandings amplified by distance and fear. And sometimes there was conflict. Scripture does not hide this. The descendants of Ishmael appear in the margins of Israel's story as traitors, neighbors, rivals, and occasional adversaries. They are not portrayed as monsters, but as real peoples with interests, strategies, and agency. This matters because it reminds us that ancient conflicts were not born of hatred alone. They emerged from competing needs, survival strategies, and historical memory. The desert tribes valued movement and autonomy. The settled tribes valued inheritance and continuity. When drought struck, these values collided. When power shifted, suspicion followed. Over time, memory began to harden. What started as family tension became cultural distance. Stories emphasized differences more than shared origin. Brotherhood faded into rivalry, not always violent but persistent. And yet the connection was never fully severed. Genealogies preserved the link. Names echoed across traditions. Even in disagreement, there was recognition. They knew they were related. This complicated everything. Because conflict between strangers is simpler than conflict between kin. The Ishmaelites were not outsiders in the absolute sense. They were cousins, close enough to threaten identity, distant enough to resist assimilation. This dynamic repeated across generations. Empires exploited it. Foreign powers learned to pit settled peoples against nomadic ones. Trade alliances were formed, broken, and reformed. Desert tribes were hired as guides, scouts, or mercenaries, then dismissed as ungovernable. Yet no empire fully controlled them. The Ishmaelites adapted. When roads were blocked, they found others. When cities fell, they moved on. When alliances shifted, they survived. Their strength lay not in dominance, but in persistence. As the world moved closer to the common era, these ancient identities did not disappear. They evolved. Languages changed. Religions expanded. Political structures grew more complex. But beneath these layers, ancestral memory remained. People still traced who they were to who their fathers had been. And Ishmael's name still carried weight. It represented independence. It represented resilience. It represented a life shaped by divine hearing, not human approval. This legacy influenced how later generations understood themselves in relation to others. Not as forgotten, not as accidental, but as intentional, formed in hardship, sustained by promise. The modern world often looks back at ancient conflicts and assumes inevitability, as if history had no other path. But Ishmael's story suggests something more nuanced. That difference does not require erasure. That shared origin does not guarantee harmony. That identity, once formed, can either build bridges or walls. In the next chapter, we will explore how this ancient inheritance resurfaced in one of history's most influential moments, when prophecy, lineage, and desert memory converged to reshape the spiritual landscape of the world. History has a way of circling back to its unfinished stories. Long after Ishmael's bones had returned to the desert, long after his name had been woven into genealogies and prayers, the wilderness began to speak again, not with thunder, but with quiet inevitability. Empires rose. Empires fell. Yet the desert endured. By the time the world approached the turning point, we now call the common era the lands once walked. By Ishmael's descendants had become crossroads of belief. Trade routes carried not only spices and silk, but ideas, expectations, and long-held hopes. The ancient question lingered beneath the surface. Had God finished speaking? Among Isaac's descendants, the answer was a waiting silence. Prophets had come and gone. Visions had faded. The people clung to memory, law, and promise, anticipating something yet to be fulfilled. Among the descendants of Ishmael, the desert held its breath differently. They remembered a God who hears cries in isolation, a God who answers without temples, a God who reveals wells where none appear to exist. This memory shaped their spiritual posture not of entitlement, but of attentiveness. And then in the deep silence of the Arabian wilderness, something happened. Not in palaces, not in centers of power, but in a place shaped by wind, rock, and reflection. A voice called. It did not announce itself to kings. It did not descend upon cities rich with institutions. It came to a man accustomed to solitude, a man formed by the rhythms of the desert, by trade routes and night skies, by lineage traced back through memory rather than monuments. The desert had spoken before. Now it spoke again. This moment did not erase earlier stories, it echoed them. Themes once lived by Ishmael resurfaced: exile, and calling, isolation and purpose, endurance and obedience. Once again, revelation did not seek comfort. It sought availability. The people who received this message understood something others struggled to grasp: that God's voice had never been confined to one geography or lineage. It had always moved where hearts were prepared to listen. And hearts shaped by the desert had learned how. This new chapter did not negate Isaac's inheritance, nor did it rewrite earlier covenants. Instead, it expanded the scope of divine engagement, reminding humanity that the God who speaks to settled nations also speaks to wandering ones. Lineage mattered, but it was not exclusive. Memory mattered, but it was not static. The descendants of Ishmael recognized the pattern. A man called. A message received. A people formed not by conquest but by submission to something greater than themselves. This was familiar. They had seen it before in their ancestors' survival, in their own endurance across centuries of movement and marginalization. The desert was not empty. It was preparatory. As the message spread, it challenged existing power structures. It unsettled assumptions about where holiness resided. It recentered faith, not around inheritance alone, but around obedience and community. For many, this was disruptive. For others, it felt inevitable. The God who heard Ishmael beneath a bush would hear again. The God who provided water in desolation would provide guidance in confusion. This was not coincidence. It was continuity. The ancient story had not ended, it had been waiting. And as this new revelation began to shape the world, old tensions resurfaced alongside new possibilities. Shared ancestry suddenly carried renewed significance. The sons of Abraham were no longer separated only by land, but by interpretation, allegiance, and vision. The question was no longer simply, who are we descended from? It became, who are we listening to? In the next chapter, we will see how this moment, born in the desert, reshaped global faith, redefined identity, and reignited questions. First whispered between two brothers long ago. Because when the desert speaks, history listens. Every revelation, no matter how profound, creates a dividing line. Not between good and evil, but between those who are willing to listen and those who are not ready to hear. When the desert voice began to shape a new community, it did not arrive in a vacuum. The world it entered was already saturated with belief, tradition, and expectation. For some, the message felt like a continuation of ancient truths. For others, it felt like a challenge sent a threat. This tension was not new. It echoed the earliest fracture between two brothers. Isaac's descendants, shaped by covenant and law, had learned to preserve faith through structure. Their identity was guarded through lineage, ritual, and memory. Revelation for them belonged within recognized patterns. Prophets who fit established expectations, promises unfolding according to inherited understanding. The new voice did not follow those rules. It emerged from the margins. It spoke in the language of the people, not the elite. It demanded transformation rather than validation. This unsettled those whose authority depended on familiarity. Meanwhile, among the descendants of Ishmael, the message spread with surprising resonance, not because it was easy, but because it felt known. It mirrored the rhythm of their history guidance in isolation, purpose without privilege, obedience without certainty. The desert had taught them that survival itself was a form of faith. Still, acceptance was not universal. Every tribe wrestled, every family debated. Allegiance was not inherited, it was chosen. Old customs collided with new calls. Leaders feared loss of influence. Elders feared loss of identity. Resistance formed. Some opposed the message openly. Others resisted quietly by delay, by reinterpretation, by hesitation masked as caution. The struggle was not merely theological, it was personal. To accept this revelation meant reordering life. And reordering life always cost something. As the community grew, external pressure mounted. Established powers, political and religious, watched with concern. A people united not by blood alone, but by shared submission to divine will was difficult to control. The desert had produced a movement that did not depend on geography. This made it dangerous. Conflict followed. Not always with swords, but with exclusion, mockery, and moral pressure. Believers were asked to choose between comfort and conviction, between tradition and transformation. Many wavered. Some returned to what was familiar. Others pressed forward, believing that continuity with the past did not require repetition of it. Through it all, Ishmael's shadow lingered. Not as doctrine, but as example. His life had taught that rejection does not cancel purpose. That distance does not negate divine attention. That faith formed in hardship can endure what privilege cannot. This memory strengthened those who struggled. They understood that being outside established systems did not mean being outside God's care. Opposition intensified. Families split. Trade partnerships dissolved. Social bonds strained under the weight of belief. Yet the community persisted not through force but through discipline, prayer, and mutual responsibility. They did not conquer cities. They transformed lives. The revelation demanded humility, generosity, and accountability. It rejected arrogance disguised as inheritance. It insisted that righteousness was not owned, but practiced. This challenged everyone, even those who claimed to follow it. The world watched closely. Some saw chaos, others saw coherence. Some predicted collapse, but collapse did not come. Instead, the movement solidified. Like the tribes of Ishmael long before it adapted under pressure. When blocked, it found new paths. When opposed, it endured. When misunderstood, it clarified through action rather than argument. History repeated itself, not in detail but in essence. A people formed in adversity, a message carried without monument, a faith sustained by memory and discipline. The ancient fracture between brothers had not been healed, but it had been reframed. Difference remained. Tension remained. But alongside them, a new possibility emerged that shared origin might someday lead to shared understanding. In the next chapter, we will see how this movement expanded beyond the desert, how it crossed borders, challenged empires, and forced the world to confront the enduring question Ishmael's life first raised. Can faith survive without dominance? History rarely resolves its oldest tensions. It carries them forward, reshaped, renamed, but never erased. Long after the revelations spread beyond the desert, long after communities formed and empires took notice, one truth remained unchanged. The story of Abraham's sons was still unfolding. Isaac and Ishmael had died centuries apart, but their legacies continued to live face to face. Not always in open conflict, not always in peace, but always aware of one another. As faith traditions grew, more defined identities became more guarded. What once had been shared ancestry gradually hardened into theological distinction. Memory, once a bridge, became a boundary. Each side told the story differently. One emphasized covenant and promise fulfilled through lineage. The other emphasized submission, endurance, and divine mercy revealed in hardship. Both traced their roots to Abraham. Both claimed faithfulness to the same God. And yet they no longer recognized themselves in each other. This division did not emerge overnight. It formed slowly, reinforced by centuries of interpretation, politics, and power. Each generation inherited not only belief but unresolved tension. Scripture and tradition became shields as much as guides. And still beneath it all, the original story remained unchanged. Two brothers, one household, one promise spoken in different ways. The tragedy was not disagreement, it was distance. As empires rose and fell, these identities were often weaponized. Rulers learned to exploit religious difference. Armies marched under sacred language. Borders were drawn where none had existed before. The sons of Isaac and the sons of Ishmael found themselves on opposite sides of conflicts neither ancestor had chosen. This was not the future Abraham had envisioned, and yet history pressed forward regardless. Despite this, moments of recognition still surfaced. In marketplaces, scholars debated shared prophets. In poetry, writers acknowledged parallel stories. In moments of crisis, prayers rose to the same God even when spoken in different tongues. These moments were fragile. They rarely lasted. Fear was louder than memory. Certainty drowned. Curiosity. Identity became something to defend rather than explore. And so the brothers remained apart. But separation did not mean insignificance. The descendants of Ishmael continued to shape the world in ways often overlooked. They preserved knowledge during ages of collapse. They safeguarded trade routes that connected continents. They advanced science, medicine, and philosophy, while others turned inward. Their contributions were not accidents. They reflected a legacy formed in the desert, adaptive, observant, resilient. Meanwhile, the descendants of Isaac preserved sacred texts, ethical frameworks, and spiritual traditions that influenced law, morality, and community across generations. Both legacies mattered. Both carried truth. The tragedy was that history framed them as rivals rather than complements. Ishmael's life had once demonstrated that divine blessing was not exclusive, that survival itself could be sacred, that being outside a covenant did not mean being outside God's care. But this lesson was difficult to sustain across centuries. Power complicated faith. Fear distorted memory. And yet Ishmael's story refused to disappear. It resurfaced whenever communities questioned rigid boundaries, whenever people asked whether God's mercy could extend beyond inherited identity, whenever faith was tested by exclusion rather than compassion. In these moments, Ishmael stood as a quiet witness, not accusing, not demanding, simply present. His life asked a question history still struggles to answer. Can siblings with shared origins choose understanding over dominance? So far, the answer has been incomplete. But incomplete does not mean finished. History is not a closed book. It is a living narrative, one shaped by choices, not inevitability. In the next chapter, we will step closer to the present, where ancient divisions continue to influence modern conflicts, perceptions, and identities, and where Ishmael's legacy still whispers an alternative path. Because some stories do not demand resolution. They demand responsibility. The modern world likes to believe it has outgrown ancient stories. We speak of technology, borders, and politics as if they exist independently of memory. Yet beneath every headline, every conflict, every inherited fear, the past still breathes quietly, guiding the present. The story of Ishmael is one of those breaths. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not demand attention, but it lingers, woven into identity, language, and the way communities understand themselves in relation to others. In the modern era, the descendants of Abraham no longer live only in tents or villages. They inhabit nations, cities, and global networks. Yet the questions that shaped their ancestors remain strikingly familiar. Who belongs? Who inherits? Who decides what is sacred? For many, identity has become something fragile, guarded fiercely, in a world that feels increasingly unstable. Religion, once a source of meaning, is often turned into a marker of division. History is simplified into slogans, and ancient wounds are reopened without remembering how they began. Ishmael's legacy sits uncomfortably within this landscape, because his story refuses simplicity. He was not the chosen heir, yet he was blessed. He was sent away, yet he was not abandoned. He lived outside the covenant, yet he remained within God's attention. This tension challenges modern assumptions. It questions narratives that divide the world into insiders and outsiders. It unsettles ideologies that reduce faith to inheritance rather than responsibility. It reminds us that survival itself can carry purpose. In regions shaped by Abrahamic faiths, echoes of Ishmael still influence perception. Political disputes are often framed as ancient inevitabilities, as if modern people are merely reenacting stories written thousands of years ago. But that interpretation misunderstands the past. History does not force repetition, it reveals patterns. And patterns can be changed. The descendants of Ishmael spread across nations and cultures are not living replicas of ancient tribes. They are teachers, doctors, artists, parents, and thinkers, navigating the same uncertainties as the rest of the world. Yet they carry a memory older than borders, a memory shaped by endurance rather than dominance. Likewise, the descendants of Isaac carry a legacy of law-ethical struggle and covenantal reflection that has shaped global moral thought. These legacies are not enemies by nature. They were never meant to be. The tragedy is not difference, it is forgetting shared origin. Modern conflicts often amplify what separates and silence what connects. Social media, politics, and fear thrive on oversimplification. Complex histories are reduced to blame. Identity becomes weaponized. In this environment, Ishmael's story offers a quiet alternative. It suggests that being heard by God does not require centrality, that divine purpose is not monopolized by power, that faith formed in hardship may hold wisdom stability alone cannot provide. This does not erase disagreement. It does not dissolve theological differences, but it reframes them. It asks whether coexistence requires sameness or simply humility. The modern world does not need Ishmael to resolve every conflict. It needs him to remind us that exclusion is not the same as absence, that those pushed to the margins often carry insights the center overlooks. His life stands as a counter-narrative to despair, a reminder that history's overlooked figures still shape its future. As societies wrestle with identity, migration, faith, and belonging, Ishmael's legacy quietly reemerges, not as doctrine, but as invitation. An invitation to listen before labeling, to remember before reacting, to recognize shared humanity beneath inherited difference. The desert taught Ishmael that survival depends on awareness of land, of people, of God's provision. That lesson remains painfully relevant. In a world increasingly divided by certainty, perhaps what is needed is not louder conviction but deeper listening. And that brings us to the final movement of this story. Because Ishmael's life was never about the past alone. It was always pointing forward. There comes a moment in every long story when inheritance stops being something we receive and becomes something we decide. Ishmael's life reached that moment early. He did not choose to be born into tension. He did not choose exile. He did not choose to be the son who walked away rather than stayed. And yet everything that followed depended on how he responded. That is why his legacy still matters. Not because of what happened to him, but because of what he did with it. The modern world often treats legacy as something fixed, a matter of bloodline, culture, or history that determines identity without consent. But Ishmael's story disrupts that assumption. He inherited rejection. He chose endurance. He inherited separation. He chose survival without bitterness. He inherited silence from people. He trusted that God still heard. This is where legacy becomes choice. Every generation after Ishmael faced the same crossroads. They could define themselves by what they lacked or by what they had been given. They could cling to resentment or cultivate resilience. They could turn memory into grievance or into guidance. They chose the desert path, not because it was easier, but because it demanded awareness, discipline, and humility. That choice shaped centuries, and now it confronts us again. Modern societies inherit stories heavier than we realize. Stories of division, privilege, exclusion, and fear. Stories that explain why we distrust certain people, why some identities feel threatening, why difference feels dangerous. These stories arrive uninvited, but they do not have to remain unquestioned. Ishmael's life stands as a quiet challenge to inherited hostility. It asks, will you define yourself by what was denied or by what you build? Will you let history excuse resentment or inspire responsibility? Will you repeat the fracture or learn from it? These questions are uncomfortable because they remove easy blame. They shift focus from ancestors to choices. Ishmael never denied the injustice of his beginning, but he refused to let injustice determine his ending. He allowed hardship to sharpen him, not harden him. That distinction matters. Hardship can produce wisdom or weaponry. Memory can produce humility or hatred. The difference lies not in circumstance, but in response. In a fractured world, Ishmael's legacy offers no quick solutions. It does not promise unity through agreement. It does not pretend differences will disappear. Instead, it offers something rarer: perspective. It reminds us that God's attention is not limited by human boundaries, that being outside the center does not mean being outside purpose, that those who endure quietly often shape history more than those who dominate loudly. Ishmael did not control narratives written about him, but he controlled how he lived within them. That is the invitation his story leaves behind. Not to rewrite history, but to refuse being imprisoned by it. Every generation stands between memory and meaning, between what was handed down and what will be handed forward. Ishmael's descendants did not erase their origin. They carried it, but they did not let it consume them. They moved forward. So must we. Whether divided by faith, culture, or ideology, the choice remains the same. We can inherit tension and amplify it, or inherit tension and transform it. The desert teaches that survival is not accidental. It is learned, practiced, chosen daily. Ishmael learned that early. And his life whispers across time, not accusing, not demanding, but asking, what will you do with what you've inherited? The answer to that question is never written in Scripture alone. It is written in how we listen, how we respond, how we choose. And that brings us to the final page, where the story does not end, but turns outward toward those who have heard it. Every great story ends not with an answer, but with a mirror. And the story of Ishmael is no different. Because long after the tents have vanished, long after the wells have shifted beneath the sands, long after names have turned into nations and nations into memories, one truth remains quietly alive. God heard, not only then, but always. Ishmael's life does not conclude with monuments or final speeches. It fades into something far more enduring presence. His body returned to the dust of the desert, but his story refused to stay buried. That is because his life was never meant to be read as history alone. It was meant to be recognized. Recognized by those who have felt unseen, by those who were pushed aside, by those who believed their story ended before it truly began. The boy beneath the bush becomes the man who listens to the wind. The rejected son becomes the father of princes. The one sent away becomes the one remembered across generations. Not by force, not by conquest, but by faith shaped through endurance. And here is where the story reaches us. Because every age produces its own deserts. Places where hope feels scarce, where identity feels fragile, where silence feels louder than promises. Some deserts are geographic. Others are emotional, spiritual, social. And in those deserts, people still ask the same question Ishmael once did, though often without words. Does anyone hear? The world answers with noise, with opinions, with power. But the story of Ishmael reminds us that God answers differently. He answers with presence. Not always by removing the desert, but by opening wells within it. Not always by restoring what was lost, but by revealing what can still be built. Ishmael never returned to Abraham's tent, but he did not need to. He discovered that God's faithfulness was not confined to one place, one lineage, or one narrative. That realization changes everything. It means your story is not invalid because it is different. It means rejection does not cancel purpose. It means silence from people does not equal absence from God. The desert did not erase Ishmael. It refined him. And refinement is rarely gentle. It strips illusions. It removes dependencies. It teaches listening. Ishmael learned to hear God not through crowds or altars, but through survival, responsibility, and memory. And perhaps that is why his legacy endures across faiths, cultures, and centuries. Because it does not belong to one people alone. It belongs to anyone who has ever stood at the edge of despair and discovered that being heard can change the course of a life. The scriptures say, God heard the voice of the boy, but they do not say God stopped listening afterward. That is the final truth this story leaves us with. God hears the cry before it becomes a prayer. He hears the whisper before it becomes a shout. He hears the forgotten before they are remembered by history. Ishmael's name was prophecy before it was identity. God hears. And that name still speaks. It speaks to those who feel written out of narratives, to those who believe promises are for others, to those who assume their role is secondary, temporary, or expendable. It says your life is not an accident. It says endurance is not failure delayed, it is strength in formation. It says the desert is not the end of the story. As this story closes, it does not ask you to choose sides. It does not demand agreement. It does not simplify complex histories. It simply invites reflection. Where have you been unheard? Where have you mistaken silence for abandonment? Where might a hidden well still wait to be revealed? Ishmael's story does not resolve tension, it transcends it. Because the deepest legacy is not land, lineage, or power. It is knowing that even in exile, even in separation, even in silence, God hears. And if he heard then, he still hears now. The desert wind continues to move. The sands continue to shift. History continues to unfold. But the voice that answered a boy beneath a bush has never gone quiet, and neither has the promise.